There's a driver's license taped to the inside of a filing cabinet and a background shot of the episode Sleepy Time. And if you pause on it, and I mean actually pause, freeze the frame, lean in close, you can read a birth date. November the 30th, 1942. It belongs to a crab. Not a metaphor, not a nickname. An actual crustacean, red-shelled, unmistakably crab-shaped, currently asleep and dreaming about the safe where he keeps his money. If that were the only piece of paper, this would be a throwaway gag and nothing more. But there's a second license. Different episode called Mall Girl Pearl, same crab, and the birth year printed on it is 1960. 18 years apart. Same face, same name, 2 lives. Nobody in the series has ever mentioned the discrepancy. Nobody ever will. It just sits there, in 2 separate frames, made by 2 separate art departments, probably years apart, quietly disagreeing with itself forever. I like that example more than almost anything else in this show, because it isn't a plot hole in the dramatic sense. Nothing hinges on it. No episode turns on Mr. Krabs' exact age. It's just a fact that exists twice, in 2 incompatible versions, inside a cartoon about a sponge who works at a restaurant under the sea, and the writers simply never noticed, or never cared, or knew and shrugged. And once you start looking for that kind of thing in SpongeBob SquarePants, you find it is absolutely riddled with it. Not mistakes exactly, more like little sealed rooms the writers built and then walked away from without locking the door. So that's what we're doing tonight. Not a plot recap, you already know the plot, you have probably seen most of these episodes twice. Tonight is a tour through the unresolved corners of this show. The places where the canon contradicts itself and never picks a winner. The places where fans built an entire mythology out of a detail the crew never intended to be mythology. The places where something got made, then cut, then denied, then rediscovered decades later in a DVD commentary or a Twitter reply from a writer who probably forgot anyone was still listening. 2 versions of an origin story that never reconcile. A driver's license that makes a children's cartoon character canonically 13 years old. A locker full of gym socks that it never quite calls hell, but clearly means. Some of this is documented fact, sourced, dated, on the record. Some of it is only ever going to be a theory, something fans built out of scraps because the writers left the door open and never came back to close it. I'll tell you which is which as we go. That's rather the whole point of a mystery, I think. You're allowed to sit in the not knowing. There's no ranking tonight, no countdown, no big reveal saved for the end. I'm not going to tell you the one theory that explains everything, because there isn't one, and if somebody promises you that, they're selling you something. Each mystery we get into tonight stands on its own, a room in the same house, and you can wander into any of them without having been in the last one. So if you drift off somewhere in the middle, you haven't missed a payoff, because there isn't a payoff. There's just more house. If you like this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere, no pressure either way. That's the only time I'll mention it. Right? Let's start with the one that got me thinking about all this in the first place, which is the building itself. The Krusty Krab. Not what happens inside it. The building. Ask most fans where the Krusty Krab came from, and you'll get a confident answer delivered like settled trivia, usually something like, oh, it used to be a retirement home, or it used to be Krabs' pirate ship, said with the certainty of someone repeating a thing they read once and never checked. The truth is messier and, honestly, more interesting than either answer alone. The series has given us several accounts of Mr. Beast Krabs' past, and it is worth being precise about which ones are actually about the building and which ones are about the crab. The one account that actually addresses the building's origin comes from the episode Krusty Krab Training Video, where new employees are shown a corporate history reel explaining that the site was once a bankrupt retirement home before Mr. Krabs converted it into a restaurant. That is, as far as the writers have ever committed to paper, the origin of the physical structure. One version. Not 2 competing ones. One. Now, separately in Grandpappy the Pirate, we learn that Mr. Krabs once owned and captained an actual pirate ship, which he sold off when he retired from the sea to open a business. That's a real piece of his personal history, a ship he sailed, a life he lived before the apron. But here's the detail people tend to skip past. In that same episode, when his grandfather comes to visit, Mr. Krabs panics and dresses the restaurant up with props, netting, a fake prow, the works, specifically to disguise it as looking like a ship, in order to fool the old man into thinking he's still living the seafaring life his grandfather expects of him. If the building already were the ship, there'd be nothing to disguise. The whole gag only works because the Krusty Krab is not the ship, and Mr. Krabs is faking it. So that popular claim, the one you'll see repeated with total confidence online, that the restaurant is literally his old pirate vessel, dry docked and repurposed, doesn't actually hold up against the one episode most people cite to support it. It's a separate object from a separate chapter of his life, sold off, gone, never claimed to be the building we see every episode. Then, there's Friend or Foe, which I think is the most interesting document in this whole file because it isn't really about the building at all. It's about Mr. Krabs and Plankton's shared history, and it does something rather unusual for a kids' show. It gives you 3 flatly contradictory versions of the same event and refuses to tell you which one is true. Mr. Krabs tells his version, in which he is the wronged party, generous and betrayed. Plankton tells his version, in which he is the wronged party, generous and betrayed, with the details of the friendship rearranged to put himself in the sympathetic light. And then Karen, Plankton's computer wife, flatly tells both of them they are lying, and offers her own account, which nobody on screen ever confirms either. 3 narrators, 3 stories, and the episode ends without adjudicating any of them. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to describe that as a mistake, as the writers not bothering to settle on a canon version of events. I don't think that's what happened. I think that's the point. It's a deliberate, unreliable narrator device dropped into a Nickelodeon cartoon with no fanfare, and it has just been sitting there for years as an intentional, permanent, structural mystery. Nobody is meant to fix it. It isn't broken. Here's a detail that tends to get lost underneath all the theorizing about the restaurant's past. The Krusty Krab is modeled on a real place. Stephen Hillenburg worked as a fry cook, as a teenager, at the Islesford Dock restaurant on the Cranberry Isles in Maine, and the connection isn't some fan's guess. He confirmed it under oath in an actual court case in 2008 concerning its storylines. The exterior design of the Krusty Krab is deliberately built to evoke a lobster trap, which, if you think about it for half a second, is a rather dark little joke to build a beloved restaurant around, since a trap is not generally somewhere you want to be a regular customer. And Mr. Krabs himself wasn't invented from nothing either. He's modeled on Hillenburg's actual manager at that restaurant, a red-headed, muscular former army cook with a strong Maine accent that Hillenburg has said reminded him of a pirate. Red hair became a red shell. The accent became the voice. But, and this is the part I find genuinely touching in a strange way, the character's defining trait, his bottomless, cartoonish greed, was invented purely for comedy. It wasn't a trait of the real man. Hillenburg took someone he apparently liked enough to remember in detail decades later, kept the voice, kept the look, and then bolted an entirely fictional flaw onto him because it was funnier. So somewhere out there, or once was, a real Maine fry cook manager who is nothing like the character built in his image, except in the ways that don't matter to the plot at all. If you're starting to drift already, that's completely fine, honestly. We've barely gotten going, and there's no test at the end of this. Nothing here needs to be remembered. Come back in whenever you surface. The house doesn't lock its doors, so where does that leave the Krusty Krab? Not 2 contradictory origin stories, which is the tidy version people repeat. More like 3 or 4 adjacent but non-overlapping stories, 1 about the building, 2 about the man, and 1 about a friendship. Neither party can be trusted to describe honestly sitting on top of a design based on an actual restaurant on an actual island off the coast of Maine. It isn't a plot hole so much as a stack of true things about different subjects that people have flattened into a single contradiction, because that's a tidier story to tell. Which, now that I say it out loud, might be the most SpongeBob thing about the whole mystery. The writers gave us the real complexity. We're the ones who simplified it into a puzzle with a wrong answer. Now, if the building itself resists a clean origin story, the thing inside it, the actual patty, resists one even harder, and that felt like the natural next room to wander into. Here's a question that sounds simple, and somehow gets less answerable the longer you look at it. What is a Krabby Patty made of? The show has told us repeatedly in different episodes, and never told us the same thing twice. In The Great Patty Caper, the secret is presented as flour and barnacle shavings, stated plainly as though that settles it. Elsewhere, in Plankton's Army, and again in Growth Spout, and then again in the second movie, Sponge Out of Water, the secret ingredient is not a physical ingredient at all, it's love. SpongeBob's love for his work, cooked directly into the patty. Those 2 answers cannot both be the literal truth. A foodstuff cannot simultaneously be defined by its physical composition and by an abstract emotional quality with no mass, and the show has simply never tried to reconcile them. It offers whichever answer suits the joke of that particular episode, and moves on. There's also a persistent piece of writer testimony worth mentioning honestly rather than pretending it settles anything either. Vincent Waller, one of the show's longtime writers, and later a showrunner, has said publicly that there is officially no meat in a Krabby Patty at all, and that the ingredients you sometimes see listed on screen are intentionally written as nonsense, gibberish dressed up to look like a formula. Which is a strange thing for a writer to say about a franchise whose signature food item is called a patty, a word that in the real world means exactly one thing. And it gets stranger because other episodes, Friend or Foe among them, and Call the Cops, show on-screen text listing chum as a literal component of the formula, chum being, in real fishing terminology, ground-up fish parts used as bait. So you've got a writer on record saying there's no meat in it, and the show itself, in its own on-screen prop work, occasionally disagreeing with him. I don't think there's a way to resolve that cleanly, and I'm not going to pretend there is. It's a contradiction between what was said off-screen and what was drawn on-screen, and both halves are real, documented, and irreconcilable. There's also a rumor worth flagging specifically as a rumor, because it gets repeated as though it's an established piece of dark lore, and it isn't. Back around 2014, an internet story circulated claiming that a Google image search or search suggestion connected to the formula turned up something involving the phrase Poseidon's powder, framed by some corners of the internet as a coded reference to cocaine. Let me be blunt about this one. It was never confirmed by the show, never confirmed by any writer, and traces back to an unverifiable claim about search engine behavior from over a decade ago. Treat it exactly as what it is, an internet rumor with no documented origin inside the actual production, and not a real piece of the show's mythology however often you might see it repeated as fact in a comment section. Now, who actually has access to this formula, whatever it's made of? The popular shorthand is that Mr. Krabs is the sole keeper, the one man who knows, guarding it jealously. That's not quite right either. SpongeBob himself knows the combination to the safe where the formula is kept, which is functionally the same thing as having access to it, and in the very first movie, Plankton actually succeeds in stealing the formula and using it, brewing his own batch of Krabby Patties with a genuine article, rather than one of his usual failed knockoffs. So the formula has, at minimum, 3 people who've had legitimate or successful access to it across the show's run, not one paranoid crab clutching a single secret. And where that formula physically lives isn't fixed either. Most of the time it's locked away in a safe or vault inside the restaurant, sealed inside a small glass bottle. The image most people picture. But more than one episode, including Plankton's Army and later The Lost Mattress, shows it hidden under Mr. Krabs' actual mattress at home instead. The show moves it around depending on what a given episode needs, without ever establishing a single canonical hiding place. It's less a secret formula than a secret with several different addresses, none of them permanent. Here's a piece of the formula's history that got cut entirely, and it's a strange one to imagine airing on a children's network at all. In the Season 2 episode, Welcome to the Chum Bucket, Plankton's original plan involved a robot double of SpongeBob, and according to a claim that circulates about that season, the episode may have originally shown more of the brain transplant surgery on screen, Plankton physically removing SpongeBob's brain in order to install it into the robotic duplicate, though that detail has never been solidly confirmed. If that is true, the sequence would have been cut before broadcast and replaced with a simple transition, the operation only implied rather than shown. It's a small thing, a few seconds of animation that never made it to air, but it tells you something about how much further the writers were willing to go in early drafts before the finished product pulled back. The show you've watched 100 times is already the softened version of itself in more places than you'd expect. If any of that ingredient business sounds like it should bother you more than it does, that's rather the nature of the whole exercise tonight. None of these things are meant to add up to a grand, unified theory of the Krabby Patty. They're just true. All of them. At the same time, in the same body of work, never reconciled. And the show has apparently decided that's fine. At this hour, with the room going soft and quiet around you, I find something almost restful in that. A secret that's allowed to just stay a secret forever without anyone insisting it gets solved. Which brings us to a mystery that isn't about food at all, but about time, and about how old anyone in this town is actually supposed to be, because once you start pulling that thread, it comes apart faster than almost anything else we'll get into tonight. Here's a detail that sounds like a throwaway prop joke until you actually do the arithmetic. In 2 separate episodes, Sleepy Time and No Free Rides, SpongeBob's own driver's license is shown clearly enough to read, and it lists a birth date of July the 14th, 1986. The show premiered in 1999. Do the subtraction, and SpongeBob is, according to the show's own on-screen paperwork, 13 years old at the moment we first meet him, flipping patties, driving a boat he cannot legally drive, holding down a full-time job at a restaurant. He is canonically too young for his own job, by the show's own internal documentation. Nobody wrote that as a joke about child labor. It's simply what happens when a prop department needs a birth date that looks plausible on a tiny background license and doesn't think too hard about what year it implies. And SpongeBob's age was never meant to be pinned down at all, deliberately so. There is no canonical numeric age for him anywhere in the officially stated design of the character, and that ambiguity appears to be intentional, the same way his exact species of sponge is left vague, the same way his exact hometown before Bikini Bottom is never specified. He's meant to read as childlike without being a child, enthusiastic without a fixed birthday anchoring him to a specific developmental stage, which makes it all the funnier that the prop department handed him an actual, specific, legally binding birth date anyway, one that happens to make him a young teenager working what should be an adult job in direct tension with every single ageless reading of the character that the writers otherwise seem to want you to hold in your head. Then Comp Corral arrived in 2021 and made things worse, not better, in the specific way that prequels made decades after the fact tend to. Comp Corral establishes that all the core characters, SpongeBob and Sandy included, are roughly 10 years old during a summer at camp, years before the events of the main show, which would seem to line up reasonably enough with SpongeBob being a young teenager by the show's own premiere-era paperwork, except Camp Corral does something else at the same time. It shows SpongeBob and Sandy meeting each other at camp as children, becoming friends there, sharing a whole history before the series proper begins, and that directly contradicts the original show's own premiere material, specifically the segment Tea at the Tree Dome, which is structured entirely around SpongeBob and Sandy meeting, for the very first time, as adults, as strangers, with SpongeBob having no idea who this squirrel in a diving suit even is. Those two things cannot both be true. Either they grew up together at camp and SpongeBob is pretending not to know her for the first episode's sake, or they are meeting for the first time as the pilot claims, and Camp Corral simply invented a friendship that never happened in the original chronology. The show has never addressed this. It isn't one version replacing the other in some tidy retcon sense, the kind where the newer material is understood to supersede the old. Both versions are simply still out there, still airing, still available to stream, flatly disagreeing with each other about whether these two characters had ever met before the day the whole series begins. And then there's the number that I think breaks the whole ageless framing more thoroughly than anything else in the show's history, and it comes from the very first movie. In the SpongeBob SquarePants movie from 2004, SpongeBob is passed over for the Krusty Krab manager position, and part of the emotional sting of that scene rests on the reveal that he has been named Employee of the Month 374 times in a row, consecutively. Not 374 times total, spread out with gaps. 374 months back-to-back without a single miss. Do that math, and you get a tenure of just over 31 years at a single fast food job. 31 years for a character whose entire design language, voice, proportions, and behavior reads as somewhere between a child and a young adult, never older than that. Hillenburg's own explanation, on the occasions he addressed it, was that the movie is understood to take place after the internal chronology of the show has effectively ended, sometime further down the line than the episodes themselves, which helps a little. It gives you somewhere to put those 31 years that isn't directly inside the time frame of the cartoon you've been watching, but it only partly resolves things, because nothing about SpongeBob's appearance, his voice, his relationships, or his general demeanor in that movie reads as 31 years older than the SpongeBob of the pilot episode. He looks and sounds exactly the same. The show wants you to accept a character who is simultaneously ageless and possesses a documented, verifiable 3-decade employment record, and by and large, audiences do accept it, because asking the question out loud feels a little bit like asking how a dog can talk in Bikini Bottom while also being someone's literal pet fish neighbor. Some things you're just supposed to let go. If you're the kind of person this keeps nagging at, even a little, even at this hour, I'd gently suggest that might be the wrong instinct to bring to this particular show, and I say that with real affection. The ambiguity isn't a bug the writers forgot to patch. It's closer to a structural decision, repeated so many times, in so many different ways, across so many decades of production, that it starts to look less like an accident and more like a house style. Nobody who works on SpongeBob SquarePants appears to have ever lost sleep over how old anybody is, which feels like a reasonable model for the rest of us too, especially at this hour, especially with the room this quiet. There's one more piece of this age puzzle worth mentioning, mostly because it involves a character people rarely think about in these terms. Pearl, Mr. Krabs' whale daughter, is shown at various points hitting recognizable teenage milestones, school dances, driving lessons, the particular social anxieties of adolescence, on a timeline that sits awkwardly next to Comp Corral's insistence that the entire main cast was 10 years old at camp, not so long before the events of the series. If SpongeBob and friends were children at that camp, and the show has run for decades since in something like real time from the audience's side, and Pearl has aged into full teenagehood in the interim, none of those timelines actually line up against each other in any way you could draw on a single consistent calendar. I don't think that's a mystery anyone is meant to solve. I think it's a symptom of a franchise that's been running for the better part of 3 decades with barely any of the ordinary continuity department that a soap opera or a superhero franchise would insist on. Time simply passes differently for different characters depending on what a given episode needs from them that week, and the show has never once stopped to reconcile it, and probably never will. Now, from questions of when people were born, it's a short walk to questions of what happens after people die, or, in this case, what happens to people who very specifically refuse to. Take the Flying Dutchman. He shows up whenever the show needs a ghost, usually to menace Squidward specifically, or to threaten Mr. Krabs with a very particular fate we'll get to in a moment, and most viewers accept him the way you accept any recurring cartoon ghost. Green, translucent, vaguely piratical, here to deliver a scare and a laugh in the same breath. What's less commonly noticed is that the show has actually given him an origin story, more than once, and the versions don't agree with each other. The episode Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost gives us an in-universe explanation via a comic book that Squidward is reading, and it's a rather odd little tale. It describes an angry ghost whose body after death became a store mannequin, his spirit somehow bound to or continuing on from that inanimate object rather than a proper burial. That's origin story 1, comic book framed, slightly self-aware about being a piece of media within the media. But then, in a separate episode, The Curse of Bikini Bottom, a line of dialogue references the shirt I was buried in, which is a detail that only makes sense if the Flying Dutchman actually had a body that was, at some point, put into the ground in the ordinary way. A burial implies a body committed to Earth. A mannequin implies no burial ever happened, the body having become an object instead of returning to the ground. Those two accounts of his death cannot both be literally true at once, and the show has never tried to stitch them together. It just lets both exist, one inside a comic book a character is reading, one inside a throwaway line of dialogue, decades apart, never cross-referenced. And then, more recently, the SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants, which released theatrically in December of 2025, gave the character yet another origin, describing him this time as an ordinary cursed pirate or sailor, a more conventional maritime ghost story than either of the earlier 2 versions. I want to be careful about how I frame that, because it would be easy to describe the new movie as finally resolving the contradiction, tidying up decades of inconsistency with an authoritative modern take. That's not really what happened. It's not a resolution so much as a third account added on top of the first 2, expanding the mythology further, rather than picking a winner among the existing versions. The Flying Dutchman now has 3 separate, non-overlapping death stories, circulating simultaneously across the franchise, and as far as I can tell, nobody involved seems bothered by that. Given everything else we've already gotten into tonight, that should not surprise you even slightly. Now, where does the Flying Dutchman actually threaten to send people? This is the part that gets misreported constantly, so it's worth being precise. The popular shorthand, especially in clip compilations and reaction videos, is that Davy Jones's locker functions as a kind of generic undersea hell, a place of eternal punishment for the wicked broadly. That's not quite what the show establishes. In Born Again Crabs, the locker is specifically named as the resting place of cheap, stingy people. Not sinners in general, not the wicked dead as a broad category. Misers, specifically, people defined by stinginess, which, of course, makes it the perfect threat to dangle over Mr. Krabs given his entire defining character trait. The show does frame it as functioning like an underwater equivalent to hell for that particular narrow category of person, but, and this is a distinction worth holding on to, the show never actually has a character say the word hell out loud on screen in reference to it. What we're actually shown, physically, visually, is a locker. An ordinary storage locker, full of what's presented as smelly gym socks, played for slapstick disgust rather than any kind of visual dread. It's simultaneously one of the show's more effective menace devices, and, when you actually look at what's on screen, rather than what people say about it afterward, a pile of dirty laundry. The horror is almost entirely conceptual, carried by tone and music, rather than any actual infernal imagery, which, if you think about it, is a rather elegant trick for a show that needs to stay inside a children's programming rating, while still making Mr. Krabs' greed feel like it carries real cosmic stakes. Here's a small thing I find quietly funny about how thoroughly the internet has misremembered the locker's specific rules. Because the show frames it as a fate reserved for the cheap and stingy rather than the generally wicked, it means, strictly by the show's own internal logic, that a great many worse people in this universe, actual violent criminals, actual liars, actual cruel characters, would apparently not qualify for it at all, while Mr. Krabs, whose worst crime across the entire run of the show is generally underpaying an employee or reusing a Krabby Patty that fell on the floor, is the one character the show keeps threatening with it, over and over, as though stinginess were the one unforgivable sin in all of Bikini Bottom, which, given the character's entire comedic engine, is probably exactly the point. It's a moral universe built around one specific vice, applied with total, almost gleeful consistency, and no real interest in a broader system of ethics beyond that single axis. If you're fading around here, that's completely fine. You haven't missed anything structural. There's no ledger being kept on who fell asleep at which ghost story. Come back whenever, or don't, either is a fine way to spend tonight. So we've got a ghost with 3 death stories and an afterlife destination that's really a laundry hamper with delusions of grandeur. It's the kind of internal inconsistency that would sink a show trying to build a serious, load-bearing mythology, and instead just sits here, mildly amusing, entirely unbothered by its own contradictions, because nobody involved in making SpongeBob SquarePants over 27 years has ever treated internal consistency as the point. The jokes were the point. The mythology just accumulated as a side effect of a few hundred people telling jokes for a few hundred episodes without a continuity Bible to check their work against, which is, in its own way, a nice bridge into the people actually doing the telling, because some of the strangest, least mythologized mysteries in this whole show aren't in the scripts at all. They're in the recording booth. Here's the one that genuinely surprised me most out of everything in this whole pile of research, and it corrects a story that's been repeated wrong for years, including, I'll admit, probably on this very channel at some point. The popular version goes that Doug Lawrence, the writer and performer who eventually became the voice of Plankton, originally auditioned for Squidward. That's wrong. Confirmed wrong. Directly by the man himself at a San Diego Comic-Con panel in 2024. What actually happened is that Lawrence auditioned for SpongeBob, the title role. He used a deep voice, one that by some accounts he had been doing since he was young, though the exact inspiration behind it is remembered differently depending on who is telling the story. And Hillenburg didn't hand him Plankton on the spot either, which is the other detail people tend to invent to make the story sound tidier than it was. What Hillenburg reportedly did, in the room, was joke about using that same unconventional voice for SpongeBob himself, though accounts of the exact moment vary depending on who retells it. Then he gave the sponge role to Tom Kenny instead, and only afterward, separately, decided that same deep, unconventional voice Lawrence had brought in for the hero was actually perfect for a villain. Plankton was originally conceived as a minor character meant for maybe 1 or 2 episodes total, barely a footnote. Lawrence, who was also on staff as a writer, is the one who pitched Hillenburg on expanding the character into the recurring nemesis he became. So the voice that eventually became one of the show's 2 most iconic antagonist performances started life as somebody's audition tape for the good guy, got rejected for that specific role, and then got repurposed entirely by 2 different people's instincts into something nobody in that casting room had originally planned for it to be. Now, Tom Kenny's own casting is the inverse kind of mystery, less about a rejected audition and more about there never really being an audition at all. Kenny had already used the voice that would become SpongeBob's for a minor one-off character, an alligator named Al, years earlier on Rocko's Modern Life, the show where Hillenburg and Kenny first worked together. Hillenburg apparently remembered that specific voice specifically, and wanted it for his new lead character, to the point that he reportedly pushed back on network requests to have other actors read for the part, saying, more or less, that's it. I don't want to hear anybody else do the voice. Which means the single most recognizable vocal performance in the history of children's animation exists because one director happened to remember a background alligator from a completely different show and refused to let the network second-guess him. On NPR's Fresh Air, in a rebroadcast interview, Kenny described what he was actually going for as an elfish, helium-sounding register, something that reads as childlike, maybe even childish, but crucially not as an actual child, deliberately non-age specific, which lines up rather neatly with everything we already got into about the show's refusal to pin down SpongeBob's age anywhere else either. He was clear, incidentally, that he does not actually inhale helium to hit that register. It's just his voice, pushed into a particular shape. Clancy Brown's story is stranger still, because Brown wasn't primarily a voice actor at all when he was cast as Mr. Krabs, and by his own account he was given almost nothing to work from. No reference recording, no temp voice to imitate, just a written character description, a crab, runs a diner, a skinflint, and told to figure out the rest himself. What he came up with, the gravelly, half-piratical Treasure Island cadence that is now completely inseparable from the character he built entirely on his own, without direction. Brown has also said, and this is the detail I find most charming, that Hillenburg was initially somewhat wary of casting him at all, because in the room, Brown apparently came across as a little intimidating, a big presence for a character who needed to be funny rather than menacing. That signature laugh, the RRRR, wasn't an on-the-spot improvisation either, contrary to what you might assume from how natural it sounds. It was spelled out phonetically in the actual script, syllable by syllable, for Brown to perform, and the recording sessions themselves reportedly followed a loose rhythm, a couple of scripted takes performed fairly straight, followed by an encouraged improvised pass some on the crew have called the crazy take, which is apparently where a good chunk of the show's most quotable ad-libbed lines actually originate, including Doug Lawrence's running "my leg" gag as the realistic fish head, said to have come out of one of those unscripted passes rather than anything written down beforehand. Brown has noted, a little wistfully by the sound of it, that remote recording since the pandemic has cut down on that kind of spontaneous crosstalk between actors in the booth. Since a joke that used to bounce off another actor's reaction in real time is harder to generate alone in a home booth talking into a microphone, Roger Bumpass's Squidward carries its own small myth worth correcting directly, because it gets repeated constantly as settled trivia and Bumpass himself has shot it down. You'll often see it claimed that he modeled Squidward's voice on the comedian Jack Benny. Bumpass has rejected that comparison outright on the record, phrased about as bluntly as you can phrase a correction. Jack Benny? No. The influence he actually credits is a different comedian entirely, Tim Conway, specifically Conway's sad sack physical comedy style from his stage work, which Bumpass says he used to imitate before ever landing this role. What he did build the voice around, by his own account, was a written character description that emphasized Squidward's prominent nose, and Hillenburg specifically wanted what's been described as an antic, almost accordion-like quality to Squidward's laugh, rhythmically tied to that nose the way an accordion's bellows tie sound to a physical, mechanical motion. Bumpass has also talked candidly about the physical cost of playing a character built around near-constant frustrated screaming. He said the recurring ink lemonade sequences in particular left his voice noticeably strained afterward on at least one occasion, and that he now relies on opera-style diaphragmatic breathing techniques just to survive Squidward's more scream-heavy episodes without doing real damage to his voice. And one of Squidward's most quoted lines, "Fluff it," from the episode Accidents Will Happen, wasn't scripted dialogue at all. It came out of one of those crazy take improv passes, the same mechanism that gave us Doug Lawrence's leg gag, which tells you something about how much of what feels like precisely engineered comedy writing in this show is actually just very talented performers being turned loose in a booth for 30 seconds at the end of a session. Carolyn Lawrence, who plays Sandy Cheeks, has a smaller but rather sweet story from the very first recording session for Tea at the Tree Dome, the pilot segment we already talked about in the context of that Comp Corral contradiction. She's described Hillenburg personally coaching her in that session to slow her line delivery down, because she instinctively sped up whenever she got excited about a line. She's noted, with what sounds like genuine amusement, that this happens to be true to actual squirrel behavior in the wild too, which is either a coincidence or a small unintentional piece of character truth nobody planned for. Her own path into the role started almost by chance, a sidewalk encounter with a casting director in Los Angeles, her entire audition packet reportedly just a single character drawing and a short paragraph of description, which is a strikingly thin basis on which an entire performer's decades-long relationship with a character got built. If any of that voice booth trivia is the kind of thing that's keeping your mind a little too awake right now, that's fine. Let it drift. None of this needs holding on to past tonight. It'll still be true whether you remember it in the morning or not, so the recording booth turns out to hold nearly as many mysteries as the scripts themselves, mostly questions of who almost played whom, and what got kept versus improvised versus rejected outright by the men and women actually saying these lines, which, funnily enough, leads pretty directly into a character whose entire on-screen existence has been rewritten more than once, and not by accident. Take Patrick. If you asked most people to describe him in one sentence, you'd get some version of sweet, dim, loyal, a starfish who lives under a rock and somehow still pays rent, apparently, which is its own small unsolved mystery nobody's ever bothered to explain. But Patrick did not start out as any of that. Derek Dryman, one of the show's co-developers, has described Patrick's earliest concept as something almost unrecognizable next to what made it to air. In that first version, Patrick was a roadside bar owner, a bully, and specifically his anger was about being pink, framed as a genuine grievance the character carried, resentment about his own coloring driving a mean streak. It's a strange thing to hold in your head, that the single most gentle, guileless character in the entire main cast, the one whose defining trait across nearly 3 decades of episodes is a kind of blissful, untroubled stupidity, began life as an angry man nursing a grudge against his own skin. Somewhere between that early pitch and the character who actually made it to screen, someone stripped out the anger entirely and kept only the softness. And I don't think anyone's ever fully explained why, beyond the general sense that a warm, dumb friend simply worked better as a comedic engine over the long run than a bitter one would have. Patrick's design itself has a real, grounded explanation at least, which is worth setting against how strange his personality history turned out to be. His pink coloring actually reflects genuine coral pink pigmentation you'll find in real sea stars, which tracks given Hillenburg's background teaching marine biology before any of this existed. And the dumb and slow read the character projects is, according to Hillenburg, a deliberate irony rather than an accident of design, because real starfish and actual tide pools are apparently quite active and aggressive predators, nothing like the immobile, sleepy creature most people picture. So the animal Patrick is modeled on is, biologically, close to the opposite of the personality the show gave him. The design is honest to marine science. The temperament is a joke built directly against it. Now, the family around Patrick has its own quiet history of getting rewritten, and this one isn't a scrapped early pitch. It's a retcon that actually happened in public across 2 different pieces of media. Patrick's parents first appeared back in 2001 in the episode I'm with Stupid, under the names Herb and Margie Starr. Straightforward, unremarkable names for a one-off gag episode about Patrick's family visiting. Then, 2 decades later, when the Patrick Star Show launched in 2021 and promoted Patrick's family into full-time main cast members with their own ongoing storylines, those same 2 characters came back renamed and redesigned, now going by Cecil and Bunny Star. Same characters, same relationships, completely different names, patched over in universe with the explanation that they'd apparently always gone by their middle names and nobody had ever mentioned it before, which is a perfectly serviceable piece of retroactive fan service plumbing, the kind of thing plenty of long-running franchises do without anybody batting an eye. But it's worth just noticing it happened. A fully aired broadcast character identity quietly swapped out and explained away after the fact, 20 years apart. And then there's Pearl, Mr. Krabs' whale daughter, whose entire origin story almost went in a direction the show has spent decades carefully, deliberately avoiding. According to Vincent Waller, one of the show's key writers and later a showrunner, a full origin special for Pearl actually reached outline stage at one point. Not just a fan pitch or a whiteboard idea, an outlined episode, developed far enough to have a shape. And what that outline revealed, before it ever got any further, was that Pearl is a foundling, not Mr. Krabs' biological daughter at all, and it went as far as naming an entirely new character, a Mrs. Krabs, who had apparently never been referenced anywhere else in the show before or since. Hillenburg personally vetoed that special before it could progress, and according to Waller, this wasn't a one-off creative call made in the moment. It reflected one of Hillenburg's actual hardline rules for the series going forward. Never reveal Pearl's mother. Not soften the reveal. Not delay it to a later season. Never do it at all. Which tells you something rather specific about how Hillenburg thought about the show's mysteries as a category. Some contradictions, like the Krusty Krab's origin or the Flying Dutchman's death, seem to have simply accumulated by accident, nobody planning them, nobody policing them. But this one was different. This was a mystery Hillenburg apparently wanted kept, on purpose, permanently as a matter of policy, the same way a magician protects a trick not because the trick is that impressive on its own, but because explaining it would take something away that can't be put back. I find that distinction rather important, actually, now that I'm turning it over. Most of what we've gotten into tonight so far has been the show contradicting itself by accident, 2 departments not talking to each other, An old episode and a new one drawing different conclusions because nobody checked. Pearl's parentage isn't that. It's a mystery that exists specifically because someone in charge decided it should, and held that line even when a perfectly good outlined episode was sitting right there ready to break it. If you've ever wondered why some children's shows feel like they're accumulating loose threads out of neglect while others feel like they're holding a few threads back on purpose, this is about as clean an example as you'll find of the second kind. If you're somewhere between awake and not right now, that's exactly where I'd want you at this point in the night. There's nothing coming up that needs your full attention. Just let the next bit wash past if it needs to. From a mystery someone chose to protect, it's a short step to the mysteries nobody chose at all. The ones that got made, finished, animated, and then disappeared before anyone outside the studio ever saw them. Some of what follows is a genuinely strange category because it isn't about contradiction at all. It's about absence. Things that existed, that were finished or nearly finished, and then simply vanished from the version of the show most people ever got to watch. Start with Midlife Crustacean, an episode where Mr. Krabs, Squidward, and SpongeBob end up on a panty raid together, played entirely for the kind of broad, silly slapstick this show usually gets away with. Except this one didn't get away with it forever. As of August the 14th, 2018, it was fully pulled from air in the United States, not trimmed, not edited, removed entirely from rotation. Nickelodeon's stated reason was, in their own phrasing, a standards review in which they determined some story elements were not kid-appropriate, and the timing lines up closely enough with the broader Me Too era cultural reckoning that most coverage at the time connected the two directly. It's not a rumor or a fan myth, it's a documented, dated removal, and the effects have rippled forward. When seasons 3 through 5 landed on the European streaming service Sky Showtime in December of 2025, this was the one episode quietly left off the roster, still missing, 7 years after its original ban. Then there's a genuinely small, almost silly example of the same instinct at work, from the episode Just One Bite. There's a gag where Squidward jokes about the Krusty Krab's lax security by pointing at a bucket labeled water that turns out to be gasoline, ignited moments later by a robotic hand. That entire beat was cut from US reruns after its original broadcast, following what showrunner Vincent Waller has confirmed on record was a genuine standards and practices objection to the actual mechanics of the joke, a lit match near gasoline, rather than the vaguer, more commonly assumed explanation that it was a general post-9/11 sensitivity sweep. The specific gag itself was the problem, not some broader mood in the culture. And here's the detail that makes it feel more like folklore than a simple content edit. Fans have claimed that same gag, fully intact, has kept airing in a handful of international broadcasts of the episode, all this time. The joke that was judged too dangerous for American living rooms has reportedly been left alone elsewhere for years, sitting there in plain sight if you happen to be watching from the right part of the world. Shanghaied, the episode where the crew encounters a ghost ship, had its own theatrical-to-broadcast trim. In its Fly of Despair sequence, the version shown in theaters as part of a compilation release included skull and skeletal imagery that was judged too frightening for the standard television broadcast. The TV cut swapped that specific beat out for, and I promise this is real, a shot of spaghetti and meatballs instead. A substitution so tonally random it's almost funnier than whatever the original scary beat would have been. Curiously, other genuinely bizarre and unsettling imagery elsewhere in that same sequence, floating eyeballs, horned creatures, was left completely untouched, which tells you the standards process here wasn't applying some consistent, principled definition of what counts as frightening. It was picking off specific beats, one at a time, on no obvious rule anybody's ever articulated. Quarantined Crab is the strangest case in this whole category because what killed its original airing wasn't a content standards objection at all. It was the actual, real-world calendar. The episode's plot centers on a fictional illness called clam flu, forcing a quarantine at the Krusty Krab, and it was scheduled to air in the United States in April of 2020, at almost exactly the moment the real COVID-19 pandemic was reshaping daily life around the entire planet. Nickelodeon pulled it from the US schedule at the last minute for what were, by any reasonable read, extremely understandable reasons. It aired internationally anyway, including in France within weeks of its original intended date, which means audiences outside the US were watching a quarantine-themed cartoon episode, literally while their own countries were entering lockdown. A strange little accidental synchronicity nobody at the network could have planned for either way. The episode didn't actually reach American television until April of 2022, over 2 years after its original air date, And it was also left off the season 12 DVD release and kept out of the Paramount Plus catalog until 2023, meaning there was a multi-year stretch during which this one episode simply did not officially exist anywhere in the US market, streaming or physical. 2 other episodes never aired at all, anywhere, and their absence is stranger still because they were, at one point, publicly scheduled. SpongeBob Invader Pants and Krab's Army both appeared on Nickelodeon's own published summer 2015 broadcast schedule, real episodes with real intended air dates printed by the network itself, and then both simply failed to materialize when those dates arrived. Vincent Waller did eventually confirm, in a statement made in May of 2018, some details of what SpongeBob Invader Pants would have actually contained: an alien invasion plot involving pod-grown duplicate copies of the main cast standing in for the originals. Why it, or Krab's Army, never actually aired has never been fully explained on the record. They exist, as far as anyone outside the studio knows, only as a schedule listing and a handful of secondhand details. 2 episodes that got close enough to broadcast to have their titles printed in TV guides before disappearing back into whatever a cartoon episode's version of Limbo looks like. And then, saving the strangest one for last here, there's a scene that a very large number of fans will swear, with complete sincerity, that they remember watching. In I Was a Teenage Gary, people recall a moment where Squidward gets turned into a snail himself, as part of the episode's body swap plot. It's a frequently cited example of what's sometimes called the Mandela effect, this shared false memory phenomenon where large groups of people independently misremember the same specific detail of a piece of media the same specific way. Frame-by-frame analysis of every broadcast version of that episode confirms no such footage has ever actually aired. It simply isn't there, never was, on any tape, in any country. But here's what makes this case different from most Mandela effect stories, which usually just end at, well, everyone's wrong then. Memory is strange. Vincent Waller has actually confirmed, on record, that a Squidward into snail transformation was written into that episode's outline at an early stage of development, before it ever reached the storyboard phase where it would have needed to be drawn. It was cut at the outline level before a single frame of it could have been animated, meaning it never had the chance to exist as footage in the first place, and yet thousands of people remember watching it happen on screen. Which means, as strange as this sounds, everyone's memory and the documented production history are both, in their own way, telling the truth. The scene really was written. It just never got any further than a page of outline notes that almost nobody outside the writer's room would ever have read. And somehow, that idea leaked into the collective memory of an entire fan base anyway, as vividly as if it had actually aired. If that last one is rattling around your head a little as you drift, that's a fairly natural place for your brain to land on at this hour. A false memory sitting right next to a documented true one, both feeling equally solid from the inside. Don't fight it. Let it sit there unresolved, the same way the show itself seems content to let so much else go unresolved. We've been talking about episodes that vanished from inside the country. Some of the strangest mysteries in this show's history, though, only exist outside it, in places most American viewers will never have any reason to look. Here's one that most fans in the United States will never have heard of at all, because it isn't a story about what got cut, it's a story about what got redrawn. Starting around Season 5, Iran's state broadcaster, IRIB, began systematically redrawing Sandy Cheeks' wardrobe under direct government order, editing out her bra and midriff, and replacing them with an entirely new, fuller dress design, one that then carried forward consistently into Season 6 as well, to comply with the country's Islamic dress laws. This wasn't a one-off edit to a single episode. It was a sustained, ongoing act of visual censorship, applied consistently across an entire run of episodes, alongside similar redrawing of other background characters shown in swimwear. Somewhere in an Iranian broadcast archive there exists a fully redesigned version of Sandy Cheeks that most of the rest of the world has simply never seen, quietly replacing the character audiences everywhere else grew up with, for years, without any announcement or acknowledgement beyond the edited frames themselves. Russia gives us a newer, more recent example of the same instinct, and it involves a scene fans have turned into something of a minor viral touchstone, the moment where SpongeBob draws a rainbow. In 2026, Russia's state-aligned broadcaster, 2x2, censored that scene, replacing the rainbow with a plain, flat yellow arc, citing compliance with the country's expanded law against what it labels LGBT propaganda, itself following a 2023 Russian Supreme Court ruling that formally labeled the international LGBT movement an extremist organization. What makes this particular case almost darkly funny, in the way only real bureaucratic censorship manages to be, is that reporters at the time noted the original, uncensored rainbow image was still sitting right there on that same broadcaster's own promotional webpage, advertising the show even as the broadcast itself had the color edited out. The right hand doing the redacting, apparently, without checking in with the left. China took a different approach entirely, going after scheduling rather than content. Starting September the 1st, 2006, under a rule from the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television, SpongeBob and other foreign cartoons were formally barred from what's called the golden hours, 5 to 8 in the evening, on children's and cartoon channels nationwide, a restriction explicitly designed to protect and promote domestic Chinese animation by keeping the country's most valuable children's viewing slot clear of foreign competition. That restriction was expanded even further 2 years later. Nothing about the show itself changed in China. It simply became unwelcome at a specific time of day, permanently by government decree for reasons that had nothing to do with any joke or scene and everything to do with industrial policy. Indonesia offers maybe the most unexpected example in this whole pile, because the thing that got cut there has nothing to do with the show's own content in any normal sense. In the episode The Inmates of Summer, there's a shot of SpongeBob and Patrick trapped together in a hole in the ground, ordinary enough as a comic setup anywhere else in the world. Indonesian broadcasters cut that specific shot, because visually, apparently, it echoed imagery associated with Indonesia's 1965 coup, often referred to by its military code name, and the mass killings that followed, a subject that remains legally and politically sensitive on Indonesian television even decades later. It's a striking example of how a completely innocent visual choice, made by animators half a world away with zero awareness of Indonesian political history, can land as something entirely different once it crosses into a specific national context carrying its own weight of real historical trauma. The scene, notably, remains intact on Nickelodeon's own Southeast Asian regional feed, which suggests this particular cut was a local broadcaster's own judgment call, rather than a network-wide policy. The United Kingdom ran its own entirely separate British English dub of the show from 1999 all the way through 2013, when it was finally retired in March of that year, and during that run it did more than just swap accents. Currency and measurement references were localized into pounds and metric units. An episode called The Secret Formula in the American version was retitled The Secret Recipe for British audiences, and several specific gags were removed outright. Both of the jokes with implied suicide overtones in Are You Happy Now? One involving Squidward's head in an oven, another involving a rope that turns out to just be for a bird cage, were cut. So was a gag involving a shard of glass ending up in someone's head in Glove World R.I.P., and a scene of feet being placed in a fryer in Squiditis. Separately from all of that dialogue and content localization, UK and Irish broadcasts have also carried their own photosensitive epilepsy edits, with at least 3 episodes having flashing light sequences deliberately slowed down for seizure safety reasons, a completely different category of edit, technical rather than cultural, layered on top of everything else already changed for that market. And then there's the question of names, which shift more than you'd expect once you start looking at how this show has actually been localized around the world. In the Japanese dub, Squidward becomes Ikarudo, a portmanteau built from the Japanese word for squid and the name Edward, and Squilliam becomes Ikarimu by the same logic. Mr. Krabs is Connie-san, Connie simply being the Japanese word for crab. Mrs. Puff is Puff Sensei, the honorific doing the work of signaling her role as a teacher. The Russian dub, meanwhile, actually kept SpongeBob's surname in its original English form for its first 4 seasons, only beginning to translate it into Russian starting around season 5, and the first movie, meaning Russian viewers of the earliest episodes were watching a version of the character with a fully Russian first half of his name, and an untranslated English surname sitting right next to it for years, before anyone apparently decided that was worth fixing. There's a real human cost buried inside one of these dubbing histories too, worth naming plainly rather than treating as a piece of trivia. The original Latin American Spanish dub voice of SpongeBob, by most accounts, was not simply recast heading into season 2. By some accounts, he lost the role, along with colleagues at the dubbing studio, after a dispute over pay, though the details are hard to independently confirm. Luis Carreño took over the role from that point forward and has voiced the character for the region ever since, But the change at the very start of that long run came out of a labor dispute, not a simple creative decision about which actor best suited the part. Japan's own dub history carries a somber thread running through it as well. The dub's original Squidward, veteran actor Rokuro Naya, died of pneumonia complicating a cerebral infarction, and the role passed first to a temporary replacement, Michitaka Kikuchi, before settling permanently with Yoji Ueda. Then, more recently, Japan's original SpongeBob voice actor, Taiki Matsuno, died in 2024, which actually paused new Japanese dubbing of the show entirely for a period, until Hiro Shimono was cast as the new Japanese voice of SpongeBob in 2025. Two of the longest-running lead performances in one of the show's biggest international markets, gone within a few years of each other, the production simply having to figure out twice how to keep a decades-old character's voice alive after the person who'd always provided it no longer could. If this particular stretch feels a little heavier than the rest of tonight, that's fair. It is a little heavier. Real people and real laws, rather than cartoon contradictions. Let it settle if it needs to. There's nothing urgent in any of it that requires you to stay upright for. It's a strange thing to take in, honestly, that a cartoon about a sponge who flips patties under the sea has, over the years, become a genuine flashpoint for national censorship boards, government dress codes, labor disputes, and even, unintentionally, a country's own unresolved historical trauma. None of that was ever the show's intention. It's simply what happens when something runs long enough and travels far enough. Every place it lands ends up seeing something slightly different in it, and reacting according to its own particular anxieties, which the writers in a room in California could never have anticipated, and mostly never even learned about. Which brings us, at last, back home, to the actual controversies people in the English-speaking world do remember, or think they remember, because even those turn out to be misremembered more often than not. The one everybody thinks they know goes something like this. Back in 2005, SpongeBob got caught up in a media firestorm over being gay. Some conservative figures supposedly attacked the character directly for it, and the whole thing was a straightforward culture war dust-up about a cartoon sponge's sexuality. Almost none of that is quite right, and the actual story is more specific, and, honestly, a little more interesting than the flattened version everyone repeats. What actually happened in 2005 centers on a completely different piece of media, a tolerance video produced jointly by the Anti-Defamation League and something called the We Are Family Foundation, distributed with an accompanying teaching guide to roughly 61,000 elementary schools across the United States. SpongeBob appeared in that video alongside a whole cast of other beloved children's characters, Miss Piggy, Oscar the Grouch, and others, all part of a broader message about tolerance and diversity aimed at young kids. At a dinner in January of that year, James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, publicly suggested the video amounted to what he called a pro-homosexual message, largely because of its general message of inclusivity and the specific organizations behind it. Dobson later said, on the record, that he had been misquoted, and clarified that he never actually called SpongeBob himself gay. Media Matters, digging into the underlying material, also documented that Dobson had misrepresented the accompanying teacher's guide pretty significantly, since that guide, examined directly, made only brief, passing references to different family structures, rather than the kind of pointed advocacy Dobson's comments implied it contained. So the popular memory of this whole episode, a direct attack on SpongeBob's sexuality specifically, isn't really what happened. It was a broader tolerance video controversy that SpongeBob happened to be one face among many, filtered through a comment that was itself later walked back by the man who made it. Hillenberg, for his own part, told People magazine that same year that SpongeBob is asexual, which is about as direct an authorial statement on the matter as you're likely to get, and rarely gets mentioned alongside the controversy it was actually responding to. There were other, later religious broadcast controversies too in different parts of the world, worth naming honestly rather than lumping in with the domestic one. A Kuwaiti religious broadcaster, Nabil Alawadi, on his own television program, called SpongeBob a slur, targeting perceived effeminacy, and made a similar remark about sandy cheeks, framing the entire show as part of a broader conspiracy embedded in children's cartoons generally. Separately, a Tunisian cleric issued what's been reported as a fatwa describing the character in similarly hostile terms. These are real documented instances of religious broadcasters in specific countries targeting the show, distinct from the 2005 American controversy, distinct from each other and worth treating as their own separate data points, rather than folding everything into one single tidy narrative about SpongeBob and controversy in general. The show has apparently managed to offend people across a strikingly wide range of unrelated cultural and religious contexts for a fairly wide range of unrelated reasons over more than 2 decades, which says less about the show itself, probably, than about how many different things a piece of extremely widely distributed children's media can end up representing to different audiences who never coordinated with each other about what to be upset by. Now, away from real-world controversy and into the territory of fan theory proper, which is its own separate category and deserves to be treated as one. The biggest, most persistent fan theory about this show's setting is the idea that Bikini Bottom exists as a kind of nuclear wasteland, its residents mutated sea creatures living in the aftermath of some real-world nuclear catastrophe. This theory leans hard on one undisputed fact. Bikini Bottom is, by name, a direct reference to the real Bikini Atoll, the Pacific site of actual American nuclear weapons testing in the mid-20th century. That naming choice is completely real and completely intentional on Hillenburg's part. What isn't confirmed, anywhere, in any interview or primary source anyone has been able to locate, is that this naming was meant as a deliberate allegory about nuclear fallout, or mutation specifically. There's one interesting wrinkle worth mentioning honestly here, rather than glossing over. In an interview some years back, Doug Lawrence reportedly mentioned that the writer's room had early on floated the idea in conversation that the world upstairs is gone, and this is what's left, treating it as something discussed, even joked about, in the writing process. But that's Lawrence's own personal recollection of an early pitch or bit, not an official statement from Nickelodeon or from Hillenburg himself, and it sits in direct tension with plenty of on-screen canon, since human characters, Patchy the Pirate Chief among them, and actual surface world footage, recur constantly throughout the series in ways that would make no sense if the surface world had simply ceased to exist. So the honest answer here is that the nuclear wasteland theory has one real verified anchor point, the name itself, and everything built on top of that anchor is either unconfirmed speculation or a single writer's loose, half-remembered recollection of a room full of people joking around decades ago, not a statement of authorial intent anyone should treat as settled. Then there's Patrick, and the theory that he's secretly a genius, hiding immense intelligence behind a performance of total stupidity, usually supported by pointing at the handful of episodes where he says something unexpectedly sharp, or solves a problem nobody thought he could. Having gone looking specifically for anything that confirms this on screen, including in the Patrick Star Show, which had every opportunity to lean into exactly this kind of reveal given how much creative freedom a spin-off grants, there's simply nothing there. The spin-off leans into general family absurdity across the board, rather than establishing any hidden intelligence specifically for Patrick. It's a fun theory, and the show does occasionally give him an unexpectedly clever line as a rug-pull gag, but a rug-pull gag every so often isn't the same thing as an ongoing, confirmed hidden trait, and nothing in the record supports treating it as one. I think what I find most striking, turning all of this over together, is how differently these two categories of mystery actually behave once you look closely at them. The real-world controversies are almost always smaller and more specific than their reputation. One dinner comment about one tolerance video, misquoted and later walked back, inflated over years into a much bigger and much wronger story about the character himself. The fan theories run the opposite direction, starting from one small, real, verified detail, a name, a line in an old interview, and inflating outward into a much bigger and much more totalizing story than the evidence actually supports. Both processes end up in roughly the same place, a popular belief that's considerably larger and more confident than what actually happened, and I don't think either one is really anybody's fault, so much as just what happens to information that travels far enough, for long enough, without anyone along the way stopping to check the original source. If you're still with me at this point in the night, that's rather nice of you, though there's still no obligation attached to it. Whatever comes next will still make sense whether you catch all of it or none of it. From theories about the world the show is set in, it feels like the right moment to go even further back, past the world itself, to the version of this show that almost got made instead, back before any of this had a name at all. Before it was called SpongeBob SquarePants, this show was pitched to Nickelodeon under a completely different title, SpongeBoy Ahoy, and a leaked 1997 pitch bible for that version reveals a world that's recognizably the same idea, but wrong in almost every specific detail. Krabby Patties in that document were called barnacle burgers, sold alongside menu items like coral fries and salty sodas. The title character himself was written as a waiter rather than a fry cook. An oddly significant difference once you think about how much of the finished show's comedy depends specifically on SpongeBob's relationship to the grill. Gary's fish tank in this early version held a treasure chest full of SpongeBob's shirts and, strangely, a bed frame built out of lit tiki torches, an image that reads more like a fire hazard than a pet accessory. Squidward existed in this pitch Bible too, but as a pastel purple character with a bigger nose and a noticeably different neck shape than the squid we'd eventually get. Even the restaurant's interior was different, sketched with a wider boat hull shape and a kitchen door specifically labeled crew only. It's a strange experience, looking at a document like that, recognizing the bones of something you know intimately while almost none of the surface details match, like meeting an old friend's identical twin who has completely different opinions about everything. The name Change itself came out of a genuine legal scramble, discovered only after the pilot's voice recording had already wrapped. Nickelodeon's legal team found that SpongeBob was already claimed. The real prior claim, tracing back to a 1990s Pentek pencil line called Cool Art, featuring an artist named Kevin Pope's character also called SpongeBob, a completely different and far more mundane source than the popular internet myth about a mop product would have you believe. Hillenburg kept the word sponge in the new name specifically so audiences wouldn't mistake the character for some kind of cheese man, and landed on SquarePants for the back half. Reportedly inspired by a joke Tom Kenny made during development about, and I'm paraphrasing the sentiment here, this sponge in SquarePants thinking he can get a job in a fast food place. A throwaway line in a pitch meeting became half the title of one of the best-known pieces of children's media ever produced. Even the show's most basic visual premise, the square shape itself, had a scrapped, over-explained backstory that Hillenburg personally killed. By most accounts, a writer on the show scripted a full origin special, suggesting that SpongeBob's square shape came from a naturally round or irregularly shaped sponge carved square inside a factory, involving a villainous figure loosely tied to the 2004 movie's antagonist. Hillenburg rejected it, and by every account the reasoning was simple and deliberate. He wanted the character's exact origin to stay permanently vague, the same instinct that's kept SpongeBob's age unpinned and his species left comfortably undefined this entire time. It's the same pattern we already saw with Pearl's mother, someone in charge deciding a mystery was worth more unsolved than solved, and holding that line even against a fully scripted alternative sitting right there. The writer's room itself ran on its own strange, internal rituals, worth knowing about because they explain something about why the show's tone feels the way it does. One recurring exercise, nicknamed the Noun Game, apparently borrowed inspiration from a Ray Bradbury writing technique, where staff would draw random nouns and have to build an entire episode premise out of whatever they pulled, under real-time pressure. One writer on the show has described the room as leaning heavily on genuine personal childhood stories to fuel these premises, the general sentiment being that you had to be willing to tell your own stories and risk looking foolish. And storyboard artist Sherm Cohen has described something called the Stack of Pain, a literal, physical pile of rejected storyboard pages kept sitting in the room as a constant, visible reminder to let go of ideas that weren't working, rather than clinging to them out of sunk cost. Mr. Lawrence, separately, has said, the episode Rock Bottom traces back to a real panic he experienced at age 6 after boarding the wrong school bus and finding himself surrounded by nobody he recognized, the lesson he eventually took from it and later wrote into the episode, being simply that you don't have to freak out. The production process itself ran on a rhythm that would surprise most people who assume television is written the way a film script is written. SpongeBob scripts reportedly run notably shorter than the standard page count across the rest of animation, and for a long stretch of the show's history they were written as loose, descriptive prose blocks rather than conventional formatted screenplay dialogue. It wasn't until somewhere around season 9 or 10 that the show shifted more fully toward full conventional scripts, having spent its first decade or so working primarily from bare outlines that two-person storyboard teams then fleshed out entirely themselves, typically spending around 2 weeks roughing an episode and another 3 weeks cleaning up those boards before sending the finished pages off to be animated in Korea. Tom Kenny has said, plainly, that he's more or less lost as a performer without storyboards to act against, summarizing it as the pictures are everything, which tells you something important about how thoroughly visual this show's comedy was built to be from the ground up, dialogue coming second to a drawn expression or a specific piece of physical staging. In running through all of it, by multiple separate accounts from people who work directly under him, Hillenburg comes across as a strikingly non-controlling leader for someone whose name is on everything. Executive Eric Coleman and storyboard artist Jay Lender have both, independently of each other, described his standard response to a creative disagreement not as an assertion of authority, but as an invitation to talk through the reasoning rather than a flat declaration that someone was wrong. It's the same instinct, I think, that let Jay Lender specifically campaign to get an actual Nosferatu cameo, drawn from the 1922 silent film, into the episode Graveyard Shift as its final scare, researching the original film's imagery in enough detail to sell Hillenburg on including it. The room's culture, by every account gathered here, ran on staff being able to make a case for their weirdest ideas and occasionally win, rather than a single vision being handed down from above and simply executed by everyone underneath it. There's one earlier pitch, predating even SpongeBoy Ahoy, worth knowing about, specifically because of how completely it got repurposed rather than simply discarded. Hillenburg's very first concept, before any version of this sponge existed, was a road trip buddy story starring SpongeBob and Squidward together, explicitly inspired by the 1989 film Pow Wow Highway. That pitch was shelved entirely as its own thing, but the leftover ideas from it didn't just vanish. They got folded directly into the Season 1 episode Pizza Delivery, one of the show's most fondly remembered early half hours, built quietly out of the bones of a completely different, never-made show about two friends on the road. If you're somewhere near sleep by now, that feels like a reasonable place to be, given how much of tonight has been about things that almost existed, instead of the things that actually did. Let the two blur together a little if they want to. Neither version is any less real for you at this hour. There's a version of this whole channel's work, I think, that could just be about the show that almost happened, instead of the one that did. Every rejected pitch and every scrap design treated as its own small parallel universe. That's probably a different night's conversation, though. For tonight, there's still a bit more ground to cover in the version that actually made it to air, mostly the small stray numbers and loose ends that never got folded into anything bigger. Here's something most viewers never think about, because television trains you to assume episodes air in the order they were made. Season 1 is actually the only full season of SpongeBob SquarePants to air entirely in its original production order, start to finish, matching the sequence in which the episodes were actually completed. Every season since has been scrambled, because individual segments get produced somewhat independently of each other and are then paired up for broadcast later, on a schedule that has more to do with runtime pairing and release planning than with when any particular segment was finished. The most extreme documented case of this is Goo Goo Gas, which was actually produced in the middle of Season 5's production cycle but wasn't broadcast until it aired as the very last episode of that season, hours after the first episode of Season 7 had already premiered to audiences. Production and broadcast order had drifted so far apart by that point that a show could air behind an episode from 2 entire seasons later. The Curse of Bikini Bottom carries a similar, if less extreme version of the same drift, produced as part of Season 7's output but broadcast during Season 8 instead. The very first episode to break from strict production order at all was Nature Pants paired with Opposite Day. Back in Season 1, the 9th episode actually completed, but only the 8th to reach air, a small one-episode swap that ended up setting the precedent every later season would then follow, and eventually stretch to a much more dramatic degree. The show's own internal geography has never really settled either. Where the Krusty Krab actually sits, relative to SpongeBob and Patrick's houses, changes from episode to episode without any consistent internal map ever being established. Some episodes show it to the left of their homes, others to the right, and at least one episode, Driven to Tears, treats it as a destination you'd need to drive to, a real trip, while plenty of other episodes treat it as functionally next door, a stroll away. Nobody has ever drawn, or at least ever published, a single consistent map of Bikini Bottom that all of these placements could sit on together. It's a town that exists exactly as large or as small as any given episode's plot requires that week, and then resets itself for the next one without comment. There's a related, unaddressed inconsistency worth naming plainly, because it's the kind of thing that seems obvious the moment someone points it out and invisible until they do. Characters in this show walk around on dry land, on actual beaches, in several episodes and in the movies, without any special equipment at all, breathing normally in open air. And yet, to enter Sandy's tree dome, an enclosed, air-filled structure built specifically to let a land mammal breathe underwater, characters need special water helmets to survive the transition. The show has never explained why ordinary open air on a real beach requires no protection at all, while a domed pocket of the same basic idea, breathable air inside a wet environment, apparently requires full protective gear just to cross the threshold. Fans have proposed their own patch for this over the years, generally some version of the idea that the tree dome's air must be drier or more concentrated than normal surface air in a way that would harm an underwater creature's gills on contact, but that explanation exists purely as fan reasoning. The show itself has never once addressed it on screen, in any episode, at any point across nearly 3 decades. There's a specific misconception worth debunking directly here too, since I've seen it repeated as though it's a real contradiction when it isn't one. You'll sometimes see claims that the episode Sun Bleached, which involves an extreme sunburn or tan acquired at a party, functions as a piece of Squidward backstory that contradicts other established backstory episodes, Tentacle Acres, and Squidville specifically. It doesn't, really. Sun Bleached is a self-contained gag episode about a party gone wrong, with essentially no bearing on Squidward's actual childhood or history one way or another. The contradiction some people believe exists. There is really a case of 2 unrelated episodes getting mentally filed under the same heading, because they both happen to focus heavily on Squidward, not because they're actually making competing claims about the same span of his life. The smaller, stranger case of collective confusion involves a background character called Old Man Jenkins, which for years was really being used as a reused placeholder name applied to multiple, visually distinct, unrelated elderly fish characters in the background of various episodes, first showing up in Sailor Mouth, and then again, under a slightly different name, Farmer Jenkins, and The Sponge Who Could Fly. Writer and director Vincent Waller reportedly addressed the situation on social media around 2018, with fans coming to understand that, as of season 11, one specific, thin, green-colored version of the character was the official Old Man Jenkins going forward, while a separate, heavier-looking look-alike character came to be informally called Old Man Walker, easing years of accumulated fan confusion about which background fish was actually which. It's a strange kind of continuity fix, less about correcting a story point, and more about simply assigning stable names to characters who'd been sharing an identity by accident for over a decade. Bubble Boss has his own strange, gapped history worth knowing, mostly because his current prominence makes it easy to forget how briefly he actually appeared at first. He debuted back in Season 1, in episodes including Pickles, and appeared with an inconsistent brown coloring in a couple of early episodes, FUN and Fools, in April, before essentially vanishing from the show entirely for the next 6 seasons. He didn't return as a recurring character until Season 8's Plankton's Good Eye, and only really became a prominent, frequently used antagonist starting around Season 9 onward. Part of what revived him seems to have been an unlikely pairing nobody had previously tried, putting Bubble Bass specifically opposite Patrick rather than his usual sparring partner, SpongeBob. Fans have pointed to that pairing as a turning point, a combination some trace directly to the recurring Bubble Boss review segments that followed. The same voice actor is said to have voiced the character across this entire, oddly bisected history, present at the very start, absent for most of the show's middle stretch, and back again for its more recent run. And to close this particular stretch out with one of the smaller, stranger footnotes in the whole production history, there's the matter of David Bowie. He was cast to voice Lord Royal Highness in Atlantis SquarePants, the show's full-blown musical episode, but joined the production late enough in the process that the writers simply never had time to actually write him a song of his own, despite every other major musical guest in that same episode getting one. He remains, as far as anyone has documented, the only musical guest star in that entire episode who doesn't sing a note, a small, almost accidental piece of trivia sitting inside what's otherwise remembered as the show's single highest-rated broadcast ever, watched by an estimated 9.22 million people back in November of 2007. At this hour, small facts like that, one tend to feel oddly weighty out of proportion to how minor they actually are. A famous musician cast for a musical episode and somehow never given a song. I don't think it means anything beyond what it is, a scheduling accident nobody had time to fix before the episode had to ship, but it's the kind of detail that sits nicely alongside everything else tonight. Another small gap in a show absolutely full of them, none of them load-bearing, all of them just sort of there if you go looking. That's more or less the last of the loose threads I wanted to bring you through tonight. A whole town's worth of small permanent gaps that nobody ever got around to closing, and mostly, it seems, nobody ever really wanted to. There's one more category of mystery worth sitting in before we're done tonight, and it's the strangest one in a way, because it isn't about the fiction at all. It's about the actual numbers behind the franchise, which turn out to be almost as slippery and contradictory as anything happening inside Bikini Bottom. Start with what the whole thing is worth. As of an October 2024 retrospective marking the show's 25th anniversary, the franchise had generated an estimated $16 billion in lifetime retail sales spread across more than 700 licensing partners worldwide. Toys, clothing, theme park attractions, an entire economy built on top of a cartoon sponge. You'll also sometimes see an older figure thrown around, $8 billion, sourced originally from an Ad Age report. And it's worth being direct that this isn't a case of the number simply growing over time in some neat, trackable way. That older figure reflects a different point in time and, more importantly, appears to reflect a somewhat different underlying metric than the more recent 16 billion figure, which means the two numbers aren't really directly comparable snapshots of the same growth curve, however often they get cited side by side as though they are. And oddly, for a franchise valued in the billions, there isn't a single reliable, authoritative figure anywhere for what a single episode actually costs to make. Reported estimates for the per-episode budget range anywhere from roughly $300,000 to $700,000, depending entirely on which era of the show and which source you're looking at, and nobody outside the studio's own accounting seems to have ever nailed it down more precisely than that. A franchise worth $16 billion in retail sales, and the cost of actually producing the thing, generating all that value, is functionally still a rounding error nobody's bothered to pin down publicly in over 2 decades. The awards side of the ledger is its own small unresolved mystery too, mostly because different tracking sources simply don't agree with each other on the totals. Wikipedia's aggregated tally across every award category the franchise has ever competed in lists 209 total nominations and 103 wins. Narrowing specifically to Daytime and Children's and Family Emmy wins, the itemized count comes to 6 confirmed wins in 2010, 2014, twice in 2018, 2020, and 2022. But a separate aggregator elsewhere cites 7 wins instead, and nobody's reconciled. Which count is actually correct? The Kids' Choice Awards tell a similar story with even more spread between sources. The show has won the favorite cartoon category in essentially every year it's been nominated between 2003 and 2025, missing only the one year, 2008, when Avatar: The Last Airbender took the prize instead. But how many total wins that actually adds up to depends entirely on who's counting. Guinness World Records, in a March 2022 listing, put the total at 18 wins, making it at that time the record holder for most Kids' Choice Awards won by any cartoon in history. Wikipedia's own running tally through 2025 puts the number closer to 21, and some press coverage from 2024 and 2025 has referenced language suggesting an even higher count still. Nobody's being dishonest here, as far as I can tell. It just seems to be a straightforward counting methodology problem. Different trackers drawing the boundary of what counts as a distinct win in slightly different places, and none of them have ever sat down together to produce one single number everyone agrees on, which feels, honestly, rather fitting for a franchise that can't even agree with itself about what year its own treasurer was born. The movies carry their own strikingly uneven financial story, mostly because the pattern across all 4 theatrical releases refuses to follow any clean, upward or downward trend. The original 2004 film, on a budget of around $30 million, brought in roughly $140 million worldwide, a solid, unremarkable hit by any reasonable measure. The second film, Sponge Out of Water, released in 2015 on a budget of $74 million, dramatically outperformed the first, pulling in $325.1 million worldwide, split roughly evenly between domestic and international box office. One specific thing is worth flagging here, because it's a mistake that circulates constantly on lower quality corners of the internet. That $325 million figure belongs specifically to the 2015 film. It does not belong to the third film, Sponge on the Run, released in 2020, and you'll see sites incorrectly attribute that same number to the wrong movie with some regularity. The real story of the third film is almost the inverse of a hit. Made on a $60 million budget, Sponge on the Run had the extraordinarily bad luck of releasing directly into the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a result, it managed only a Canada-only theatrical release worth roughly $4.8 million in total theatrical revenue, before going instead to Netflix internationally in November of 2020, and to Paramount Plus and premium video on demand domestically the following March. A franchise worth $16 billion in cumulative retail value produced a film that made less at the box office than a moderately successful weekend for a mid-budget release, purely because of when it happened to come out, not because of anything wrong with the film itself, The fourth and most recent film, Search for SquarePants, released theatrically on December the 19th, 2025, has fared considerably better, with worldwide box office landing somewhere in the range of $165 to $168.4 million, sources varying slightly depending on how late in its run you check the figure. It moved to premium video on demand by January the 20th of 2026 and arrived on Paramount Plus streaming by February the 17th, where it reportedly became the platform's most watched film within a single day of its release there. Taken all together, across every film and package short counted by industry trackers, the franchise's cumulative theatrical gross cites at roughly $641.2 million, a number that, again, depending on exactly which releases you count as part of that total, shifts slightly from tracker to tracker, because apparently even counting how many movies exist in this franchise is a little bit of a judgment call. There's a genuine piece of new canon worth pausing on too, because it reframes a huge amount of the show's premise without most casual viewers ever having caught up to it, saving Bikini Bottom. The Sandy Cheeks movie, which streamed in 2024, reveals that Sandy actually works for an organization called the Bureau of Official Texas Science, and that her entire presence in Bikini Bottom, going all the way back, was orchestrated by her own mentor, a character named Sue, who used her as an unwitting Trojan horse specifically to study the town and its residents without their knowledge. That's a considerable addition to the show's underlying premise once you actually stop and take it in. Every single episode where Sandy simply seems to be a scientist who happens to live among her friends by choice now sits underneath a layer of retroactive surveillance. Her whole friendly, folksy presence in Bikini Bottom recontextualized as, at least partly, an act of institutional observation she wasn't even fully aware she was performing. It's the kind of retcon that doesn't break anything on screen. None of the old episodes need to be re-edited or reinterpreted scene by scene. But it's there now, available. The next time you watch Sandy show up at the Krusty Krab, like nothing could be more ordinary. On a lighter and considerably more literal note, this franchise has left its mark on the actual natural world too, not just licensing shelves and streaming platforms. In 2010, a research team working in Borneo, made up of Dennis Desjardins, Kabir Pia, and Thomas Bruns, discovered a new species of fungus and named it Spongiforma SquarePantsi, formally described in the journal Mycologia the following year. This wasn't just a cute pun slapped onto a discovery for headlines. Under a scanning electron microscope, the fungus's spore-bearing surface actually resembles a seafloor carpeted in tube sponges. A genuine visual resemblance that's what convinced the discovery team the name fit in the first place. It remains, as far as anyone's documented, the first species ever formally named after a SpongeBob character, a small, permanent little fingerprint left on actual biological taxonomy by a cartoon that started as a sponge comic written for a marine education center. And one last real-world number worth closing this stretch on, because it shows how far outside the world of cartoons this show has occasionally traveled. The episode SpongeBob, You're Fired, which aired in November of 2013 and dealt with the Krusty Krab laying SpongeBob off amid financial trouble, drew somewhere between 5.2 and 5.4 million viewers on its original broadcast, making it the most watched SpongeBob episode of the prior 2 years and the single highest rated cable telecast that entire night across every major kid's demographic. But its real afterlife happened off-screen entirely, airing during the middle of the post-2008 recession, at a moment when debates over food stamp policy and unemployment support were running hot in American politics. The episode got picked up by Fox News and the New York Post as a piece of cultural commentary on entitlement and government assistance, which then prompted real, public pushback from Media Matters and from Al Sharpton on MSNBC. A 22-minute cartoon about a fry cook losing his job briefly became an actual flashpoint in a national political argument that had nothing to do with sponges at all, simply because it happened to air at the wrong or right political moment. As for where things actually stand tonight, as of this recording, the show is deep into season 17, which premiered in June of 2026, following a 12-episode season 16 that ran from June of 2025 through June of 2026. Total episode count sits somewhere in the low to mid-300s, one tracking source putting it at 341 episodes across 17 seasons as of this past August, though that number moves constantly as new episodes continue to air, so treat any specific figure as a moving target rather than a fixed fact. Seasons 18 and 19 are already renewed, alongside 2 further seasons of The Patrick Star Show, And back in February of 2025, this show officially became the longest-running animated children's television show in American history, surpassing Arthur's 25 seasons. It is worth being precise about what record that actually is, because it gets overstated constantly. It is not the longest-running animated show of any kind. That record still belongs to The Simpsons, and SpongeBob SquarePants has never claimed otherwise. It's simply the longest-running one made specifically for children, which is its own real, considerable achievement, 27 years deep and, by every indication from the renewals already on the books, nowhere near finished yet. So, that's the lot, more or less. We've been through a building with more histories than it needs, a formula with more secrets than it can hold on to, a crab with 2 birth years, and a sponge with a birth certificate that makes him too young for his own job, a ghost with 3 different deaths, a locker full of socks doing the emotional work of hell, a family that changed its own middle names without ever explaining why, a fungus in Borneo that owes its scientific name to a cartoon, and a set of box office and awards figures that can't even agree with each other about a franchise that's made $16 billion. None of it adds up to a single answer, because none of it was ever building toward one. That's rather been the whole shape of tonight, and I hope by now that doesn't feel like a disappointment so much as a kind of relief. Here's the small, slightly melancholy thought I keep landing on, turning all of this over one last time. A show that's been running for 27 years, made by a few hundred people in rotating rooms across 3 decades, was never going to hold together as a single, coherent, planned universe, and I don't think anyone involved in making it was ever really trying for that. What they were doing, week after week, season after season, long after the man who started it had stepped back and then passed away, was closer to what a town actually does over time. Buildings get repurposed and half-remembered origin stories accumulate around them. Families go by different names for a while, and nobody thinks to explain why. Old feuds get told 3 different ways by 3 different people who all believe their own version. That's not a flaw in the show's design. It's just what a long enough stretch of time does to any story, fictional or otherwise. And SpongeBob SquarePants has simply been running long enough now to start accumulating that particular kind of texture, the texture of a place that's actually been lived in, rather than one that was drawn up all at once according to a master plan. Real towns work the same way if you think about it. Ask 3 longtime residents of any actual small town how a particular old building got its start, or why a particular family goes by the name it does, and you'll likely get 3 different answers. None of them malicious, none of them even really wrong. Just the ordinary residue of decades of people telling each other stories and half remembering the details. Bikini Bottom just happens to have several hundred paid professionals writing its version of that residue down on purpose, 1 episode at a time, without ever comparing notes. I don't have a tidy moral to hand you about what all of this means, and I'd be suspicious of anyone who claimed they did. If you came here tonight hoping for a single unifying answer, some grand theory that finally makes sense of the driver's licenses and the ghost stories and the formula and the fungus all at once, I'm sorry to disappoint you, though I suspect if you've made it this far you already knew that wasn't coming. I don't think the show endures because it secretly contains some hidden dark truth about nuclear fallout or existential dread that the writers were smuggling past Nickelodeon's standards department the whole time. I think it endures for something closer to the opposite reason, because it never demanded that you resolve any of it, never insisted its own contradictions be the point, and just kept telling small, funny, occasionally strange stories anyway, decade after decade, letting the mysteries pile up in the background like dust nobody's ever quite gotten around to clearing off a shelf. There's something in that I find worth taking to bed with you tonight, whether or not you were still awake for the last hour of it. Picture that license again, taped inside the filing cabinet, half hidden in the background of a scene you'd have to freeze to actually notice. November the 30th, 1942, on one document. September the 25th, 1960, on another. Nobody's ever going to reconcile those 2 dates. Nobody's ever going to walk into a writer's room decades from now and declare, officially, which one was right all along. They'll just keep existing, disagreeing with each other in silence in 2 different episodes, forever. The same way most of what we talked about tonight will keep existing, unresolved, the next time somebody sits down to rewatch this show looking for something to fall asleep to. There's more of this I want to get to. Other corners of this world I didn't have room for tonight. Other small contradictions and half-finished pitches sitting in the same drawer as everything we did cover. But that's for another night. For now, that's enough from me. Sleep well.